when ship owners built bigger ships, they knew they'd have a larger canal toll. So, it's been a little bit more than inflation, but I underscore what you said. There's no indication that the Panamanians really haven't managed in an efficient and fair way.
Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Thank you to Dataminr for sponsoring Season 4 of Maritime Nation. Let's jump right in. We're honored today to be joined by John D. McCown. He is one of our distinguished non-resident senior fellows here at the Center for Maritime Strategy. He's an internationally recognized expert in container shipping and maritime commerce. Mr. McCown has more than 4 decades of operating and investment experience in his field. He was a co-founder and CEO of U.S. flag carrier Trailer Bridge Incorporated, and also formerly led transport investments at a large hedge fund. Of note, the transportation pioneer, Malcolm McLean, the inventor of container shipping, mentored Mr. McCown, and they worked together for 20 years. John holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and is also the holder of 2 maritime-related patents. Mr. McCown is author of Giants of the Sea, Ships and Men Who Changed the World. And you can see it right here on the video next to me. I have an autographed copy, and I love that book. It's a book on the modern cargo shipping industry and how it developed. John advises, lectures, and writes extensively about maritime issues, and his regular reports on the container shipping sector are widely read and quoted. Get your newsletter every other week. At the Center for Maritime Strategy, Mr. McCown's research and analysis focuses on the intersection of merchant shipping and maritime commerce with national security. Today, we're going to discuss a really hot topic, the Panama Canal. John, welcome to Maritime Nation, and let's jump right into the Panama Canal.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral. Great to be here.
Great to have you. John, you've led a wildly impressive career working under Malcolm McLean, a Scot, by the way, and so am I, so I absolutely love that, and writing extensively on maritime issues. Before we delve into the topic of the Panama Canal today, I just want to ask you as a subject matter expert, what has been the most impactful innovation or development in the maritime sector in the last 20 or 30 years? Over to you, John.
Admiral, I think the most impactful development has been the geometric increase in the size of the largest container ships. This is a development that had implications for the Panama Canal and can really be traced back to some ships Malcolm McLean built in 1984. While he invented container shipping in 1956, what he did in 1984 is what I refer to as the second container revolution. A little bit of history to put that into context. The ships that he built, he named the econ ships. Econ ship because he thought it was the most cost-efficient way of moving containers by water. And he ordered 12 of them in what was the largest shipbuilding contract in the world at the time. And they were deployed eastbound in an around-the-world service. So, of course, they had to go through the Panama Canal. At the time, these ships were 4,000 TEU. TEU is the measure of size, 20-foot box by 8-foot by 8-foot. And these were 4,000, a little over 4,000 TEU. And they got that way by Malcolm going to his naval architect and tasking him with building the biggest ship that could go through the Panama Canal. Malcolm would use the expression, I want a shoebox. I want something that kind of goes through all of the dimensions. And that's what the naval architect did. The length, I think, was 950, 106 feet wide, which were the maximum. And these ships at the time were literally 30% larger than any container ship in the world. And so what that really did, that ushered in, and these ships then started, they proved their cost efficiency at sea. Other folks started to build larger ships. And so what that led to was really the process advantages of container shipping, that process of moving freight from one point to another in the same metal box was then really kind of joined by the scale economies of kind of jumbotization, which had occurred in the other shipping segments, particularly tankers. Tankers were up to 1,600 feet long, but you hadn't seen that in container shipping. And so as the ships got bigger, very quickly they got to be too big to go through the Panama Canal. And that, of course, set in progress what they eventually did to expand that canal. But it's really the cost efficiencies from those large ships that made, I guess, what we now call globalization possible. And it brought with it obviously economic advantages in terms of moving containers at sea at an incredibly low cost. I think that also came with some security ramifications, positive in my view. I'm a big believer in the view of more trade equals kind of more peace. In fact, IBM, if you go back to the 1940s, IBM International developed a slogan they referred to as world peace through world trade. And so I think that I'm a big believer in that. But to get back to the ship size, the ships that are now built are 24,000 TEU. So they're 6 times as large as the econ ships that really kind of ushered this in. They're 3 times larger than what they were even just at the beginning of this century. And so it's that geometric increase that has really been, to me, the most consequential development in the maritime world. The largest container ships now are actually longer than our aircraft carriers. A fully loaded container ship, the biggest ones in the world at 24,000 TEU, are carrying $1 billion worth of cargo. Every imaginable product you can think of moves in those containers. Last year, or on the last 12 months, the total volume of freight moved in container shipping was 183 million TEUs. You take the value of all that freight, and it's right at about $10 trillion. To put the efficiency measure in perspective, the total revenue of the container shipping industry right now is running at about $300 billion a year. So if you do the simple math, the total revenue of all of container shipping is 3% of the worth of the product. So that really kind of explains how globalization came about. You can literally move something from one side of the planet to another for a low single-digit measure. I am constantly, even though I've been in the industry and seen it grow, I'm constantly amazed at just the massiveness of the industry. There are now over 20,000 container ships in the world, 20,000 over 600 feet long. In my book that you referenced, I use 600 feet or 2 football fields as kind of a dividing line for what's a large ship. And there are over 20,000 container ships that do that. The other thing that always amazes me, if you take that 183 million TEUs of freight that moved, and if you were to hypothetically link them together, they're not quite that many containers, they'd stretch out to over close to 700,000 miles, literally could circle the globe in 28 times. So that's kind of an indication of the massiveness kind of economically of container shipping. Malcolm is still kind of little known, but there was an award 3 or 4 years ago that I think Malcolm would smile at. There was a project called the Human Progress Project, where they were charting kind of the major advances in civilization. And as part of that, they outlined what they called 50 heroes of progress. Most of these people have been long gone, but it's Jonas Salk, Gutenberg in the Bible. And their 17th hero of progress was Malcolm McLean. And their reasoning was that container shipping brought with it an efficiency, and particularly in the developed world. But they praised the increased trade as bringing 300 million people out of poverty. And so, I think Malcolm, well, I know Malcolm was the only business person that they acknowledged. Their 50th hero of progress was Bill Gates, not only for what he did, in digital, but really his philanthropic, in Africa. So that's kind of the container shipping industry up until a few years ago was kind of largely unknown by the public, but now people know about it. Unfortunately, we've been kind of a lot of negative things in the press between the pandemic and particularly the container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. That made people aware of the maritime supply chain. But it's a fascinating industry to me.
Well, hey, what a fascinating explanation of something that is really disruptive that's taken place over the last 20 years and innovative at the same time. Well, what's really interesting, John, in Giants of the Sea and in our conversations over time, you told me about how you were, first year, second year, 2-year program at Harvard Business School. So everybody does the first year, and then everybody tries to go out and make a little money in the summertime. Most people, whether today or back then during your time at the B School, go to New York City and they work for an investment bank. You went to work for Malcolm McLean in a trucking company. Why'd you do that?
Well, I was on the path to have a summer job at an investment bank, and there was an article in Business Week, cover article about Malcolm McLean buying U.S. lines, and it was kind of, I think the story said it was as if Henry Ford came out of retirement and bought Chrysler because Malcolm had founded Sealand. And so that cover article was fascinating, and I pursued a meeting with him and worked at the summer at U.S. Lines, and I was kind of bitten. And so I never really went back to the traditional business school path and, have been kind of in the industry ever since.
Wow, fantastic. And what a change in your life that decision to make to go to McLean Trucking had. And on the size, as things have gone from 4,000 to much bigger, 24,000 TEU over time. And you've schooled me on TEUs for the last couple of years that I've known you, which is really interesting. They just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I know we put billions of dollars into the Panama Canal to expand it for ships, but it's still not big enough for an aircraft carrier, whereas the Suez Canal is. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, but nonetheless, highly valuable to U.S. commerce. And I think the U.S. is the one that uses it more than anybody else. And finally, I'll say I love the IBM slogan, world peace through world trade. That's what the vision for globalization was. And then there are nefarious actors out there who have tried to take advantage of this. And we ourselves here in the United States have kind of let our guard down. I mean, we've got 1% of global shipping under a U.S. flag. China has 5,600 vessels out there. One Belt, One Road, China Ocean Shipping Company. I mean, they're killing it on the high seas, but they're highly subsidized. And we stopped doing that years and years ago. And you'll probably talk a little bit about that.
Yes. As an aside on the IBM slogan, it was fascinating to me to learn that the first non-American director of IBM, selected by James Watson Jr., was Maersk Moller, the gentleman who put Maersk what it was, and that was really kind of, I guess, putting into practice his view of world peace through world trade, but also realizing that somebody that had built a container shipping company like Maersk was a pretty darn good businessman that he wanted on his board.
Absolutely. You know, one of our frequent flyers here at the center is Steve Carmel, Vice President of Maersk, is now down running a subsidiary of Maersk in the Tidewater area of Virginia. But Steve was here for the 1 year anniversary of October 7th and the impact that's had on the Red Sea and the Suez, and it's actually it's hurting everybody. I mean,
Yeah.
prices are going up. The Egyptians, fragile economy, are losing billions every year without the transit of the normal level of transit through the canal. And I hope it ends soon. And I don't think I think that the new administration does not portend good things for the Houthis, and I have no sympathy for them for what they're doing to shut down trade through that area. But we're going to talk today about the Panama Canal. So let's shift to the Panama Canal. School us on the background, John. You know a lot about this. I mean, who built it? What is the economic importance of the Panama Canal? And what foreign powers have made moves to exert control over the canal? This is one of the current president's mantras, that he's tired of foreign influence over the canal. Tell us how that all plays out.
Well, for 5 centuries, Panama has been recognized as having unique geography. The dictionary defines an isthmus as being a narrow strip of land with sea on either side and connects two large areas of land. Panama is really the most prominent isthmus in the world in that it separates the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and connects North and South America. And the U.S. has had a total impact on Panamanian history, and that Panama really wouldn't exist as a separate company without actions the U.S. took over a century ago. So what's interesting to me is that, geography on the earth has really played a role in defining shipping since the beginning of time. But one of the fascinating things about Panama is that its unique geography has had folks for centuries talking about how that unique geography can be taken advantage of to significantly shorten voyage distances. So rather than geography driving shipping, it was really shipping driving geography. Balboa's initial discovery in 1513, where he was the first European to kind of lay eyes on the Pacific, has had people, thinking, how can we take advantage of this? And it wasn't, it was still in the 1500s where one of the kings of Spain, literally tasked a survey. Once they knew that it was a short amount of land, was there some way they could build a waterway? I think King Charles V wanted to connect Spanish ships from Spain with their outpost in Peru. There were various other folks intrigued in looking at it, but nothing really came other than a lot of roads and kind of cart paths to go over the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But where it really kind of started to accelerate was when the California Gold Rush. The California Gold Rush, at the time, San Francisco, I think, had in 1847 something like 300 people, and a decade later it had 300,000, and that was all driven by the California Gold Rush, and mostly Americans coming from the East Coast, and most of them would come by vessel because that was really before the railroads were going across, and they'd come by vessel around Cape Horn. And some of them started to kind of figure out, well, let's take a ship to this land, the isthmus, and then kind of go overland on some of these roads and kind of, then get a ship on the other side. And that was really that traffic led to somebody putting a railroad, which was a more efficient way and really what you would call the first kind of intermodal movement. Again, there were like 300,000 people that used that. That really kind of cemented the notion that there's it was known that they could build a canal, and that cemented the view that we need to do something. And it was really first the French that tried to physically build the canal. And the French had just come off their very successful building of the Suez Canal. And it was really the fellow that led that project that, went to Panama. That didn't end up nearly as well. And in fact, that effort went bankrupt. But they had built part of it, and that had the Americans really starting to focus on it. Now, there were a lot of reasons for the failure, but a big one was simply that Panama, even though it was less than half the distance of the Suez Canal, was much more challenging geography. It certainly wasn't flat. Rather than sand, it was tropical with a lot of growth, and then all sorts of animal lives, and of course what really kind of became a real issue, certainly for them and even for us, was disease, and we'd find out later that it came from mosquitoes. But it was really, that was the very beginning of the U.S. interest, in the Panama Canal, and it was really, I guess to pick up in terms of the U.S. involvement, it was really Teddy Roosevelt, who championed building the Panama Canal. He saw it resulting in clear economic advantages, because you could look at the map and realize that you would save 8,000 nautical miles by not going around Cape Horn. I'm sure economics were one of it, both foreign and domestic trade, but clearly Teddy Roosevelt saw that it had a clear kind of strategic national security advantages. So I think that was kind of the genesis for the U.S. looking at building the canal. And it was implemented by Teddy Roosevelt, who, his motto of walk softly and carry a big stick was evident, with his projection of maritime power with the Great White Fleet. But I've often thought that as the Great White Fleet, I guess it was 1907, and literally circumnavigated the world, but the Great White Fleet had to go around Cape Horn. 8,000 unnecessary miles must have reinforced Teddy Roosevelt's desire that we need to build this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some fascinating history there. And, I spend a fair amount of my time down in Norfolk. In fact, I'll be down there for an exercise here in the next couple of weeks. And usually I stay on the base near Dillingham Boulevard. Dillingham is where the old historic Jamestown homes are, now occupied by the Navy. And that's where the Great White Fleet started and kicked off back in 1907, 1908 to make that transit around the Cape of Good Horn. And, I was just talking to the commanding officer of the Italian ship Amerigo Vespucci, the tall ship that went around the Cape of Good Horn to get to Los Angeles to kick off their Pacific deployment, and pretty rough sailing down there. So not only is
yes.
Yeah, not only is it cut off 8,000 miles, but I haven't been around the Cape of Good Horn, but everybody I know has. Talks about the difficulty, and if you have bad weather, it can be really, really tough.
I had one person tell me that who'd been around it, and I haven't, but I think geographically, I think it's correct that that's the only place on the planet where you can do the whole circumnavigation and there's no land. So it's kind of constantly swishing around. But somebody that knew it better than I did said, no wonder Magellan called it the Pacific Ocean. Once they got out of that bobsled.
Yeah, and of course, great book out there we don't have time for today, but The Wager, that talks about the British fleet and the trouble they had down there. You are listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so that they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. Here at CMS, our whole team uses Dataminr's first alert to stay up to date on breaking news or crises that impact our national security or the security of our allies and partners. So the canal, I'm looking at a couple of charts here. It is deceiving. It's only a 51-mile transit, but you can imagine digging that ditch to actually create a waterway through that isthmus must have been very difficult. It caters to 14,000 ships a year. There's 5 container ports. You mentioned one, Balboa, Manzanillo, Colón, Cristobal, and Rodman. And annual investment-wise, I was surprised by this. The Chinese are much less invested than we are, $1.4 billion in 2023. To the U.S. is $4.5 billion. But our investment is declining. And so that's interesting as well. I think Panama pulls in about $5 billion a year. And of course, there's a Panama Authority, and I think you're going to talk about that in our next question, and then the state. And they are indeed separate because you have to maintain that canal. And just for the interest of our viewers, every time a ship goes through the canal, the Panamanians expend 50 million gallons of fresh water in the locks. It's just lost. Yes. And so there is discussion of how to create more fresh water, but that's about a $1.6 billion investment. And right now the money doesn't exist to do that. So it's a very complex system to operate. And I've talked to some of my friends down there who are naval officers working in the theater, and they say the Panamanians do it really, really well. So,
yes. And it gets back to kind of the engineering challenges of building it, but it's hard for us to kind of think of a project that is moving a lot of stuff. And I think it was over 17 million cubic yards of stuff was moved. But it really was at that time kind of a fairly high tech because it involved a lot of engineering, and it was to create, they created this giant man-made lake in the middle of it that, served a good, I think it was like 15 or 20 miles of that. And then that kind of became the reservoir to fill up the locks up and down. And I think at one point, one of the problems that the French had, they went into it thinking that they wouldn't have to build locks and that it would be even. If you did that, you'd have to move a lot more stuff. I mean, the way I think the way I understand it, the locks on each end really have the effect of lifting you up, and so that you kind of go over, it's less stuff that you needed to move. But still, it was a lot of technology. And again, one of the simple things that was able to make it possible on the U.S. side was the over 100 steam shovels. That was one of the first use of large earth-moving equipment. So it really kind of all came together in a nice way. And of course, Dr. Walter Reed was able to figure out that the disease was coming from mosquitoes, and Colonel Gorgeous, made sure there was no standing water. And so it really kind of was a great team effort. It wasn't without extraordinary casualties. During the American building, there were over 5,000 people that died, many from disease. Only 350 of those were Americans. It was mostly West Indies folks. But that was paled in front of the French effort was 22,000. Mostly people from Central America died in the construction. So, wow. It all kind of came together nicely. And the other thing that was interesting, I mean, the U.S., once we decided we wanted it, and we knew that we just needed the isthmus, we in effect recognized Panama as a new country. At that time, Panama was part of Colombia. And Colombia was no too pleased, but we kind of forced that separation, if you will, once America recognized Panama as a separate. And so it was really carved off. So that's what I meant earlier when you talk about a U.S.'s impact on Panama. It literally would not exist without what we did. It would still be part of Colombia.
Wow. I didn't know that. And that's just revolutionary in terms of creating this country, which has been very successful due to the canal. And I looked up the transit passage cost. So for a container ship, medium size that you were talking about, it's about $300,000, and you do that several times a day. I think it's maybe a little less than what I've read on the Suez Canal, but nevertheless, that's a big moneymaker for the Panama Canal Authority and the state in order to keep up the maintenance on the canal and also to bring in a little income for the state.
Yes.
And
yes.
that kind of brings us to the treaty. So we were running along fat, dumb, and happy for the better part of the 20th century. And then President Carter and President Torres in 1977 created two treaties, actually. People talk about a treaty nowadays, but this was to eventually transfer control of the canal to the Panamanians and the Panamanian government. And this started in 77, but it took until 99 to actually make it happen, right? So can you kind of
yes, that's right.
Walk us through that?
Well, that treaty is what first turned over the land, I think in like 79, and the land was the Panama Canal zone was established. Basically, it was 5 miles on each side of the actual canal, and so you take that all together, that was about 1.7% of the land area of Panama, but that was deemed to be controlled by the U.S. Much of that was what turned over fairly right away, but it wasn't until more than 20 years later, at the end of 99, that the actual canal. And so during that interim, America continued to manage it. Much of the land around it was kind of taken over by the Panamanians. And what's interesting, certainly Carter is most identified with this action, but the 77 treaty really represented the culmination of work that had been in progress both in the Nixon and Johnson administrations. The treaty itself, had some pretty strong provisions that you couldn't discriminate. So all ships have have a toll based on a tariff and a formula that is publicly disclosed. With the transition to Panamanian management, I first went to the Panama Canal in 1982, and I looked up, and at that time the average toll was 23,000. It's almost 10 times that, and if you kind of go through the numbers, that's a little bit more than inflation. About 6%, annual growth, about twice what inflation is. But you're hard pressed to really say that's even the Panamanians taking advantage, if you will, because one of the things that was going on during that period is that ships got bigger, on average, more than 3 times bigger. And so when ship owners built bigger ships, they knew they'd have a larger canal toll. So, it's been a little bit more than inflation, but I underscore what you said. There's no indication that the Panamanians really haven't managed in an efficient and fair way. The context of how this transition happened, though, is worth understanding, because when I dug into it, it's much more than I realized. And my own personal remembrance of this, when I was in business school, I happened to do some campaign work and telephone calling for Howard Baker. Largely, he was a Southerner, and I liked him, and he seemed like he made a lot of sense. And I can remember making phone calls, and half the time I'd get somebody, they'd hang up and say, he wanted to give away our canal? Because it was a very big political issue.
Sure.
Ronald Reagan certainly made it a big issue, but it seemed to be mostly politics because once Reagan was in, he didn't take any steps to do anything. But you really have to go back to really 56 for the beginning of increased tensions. And 56 is when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal,
Yeah.
and the Brits and the French were about to kind of send in their military to take it back over. And the U.S. Intervened and basically very publicly said, no, you shouldn't do this. And that, of course, got the attention of the Panamanians who were already kind of tensions, and I guess you almost kind of the what's good for the goose, why isn't it good for the gander? And so that led to increasing tensions. There were some deadly riots in 1964 in Panama. Hundreds of people were killed. I think there were even a dozen American soldiers were killed. Additional security had to be put in. Fences were made, and part of that, Panama actually severed relations with the U.S. It had become that strong. And President Johnson assured him that, we're going to focus on this and kind of do the right thing. So a process started to occur that was picked up by the Nixon administration. Henry Kissinger actually got involved, and the research that I came across literally had Carter and some of his folks saying, we wouldn't have been able to do this without the framework that Henry Kissinger established. So that puts a kind of some additional context into it. Obviously, because it was a formal treaty, it had to be approved by the Senate, and it was approved 68-32, wide, fairly bipartisan support. It was after it had actually happened, and I guess passed by the Senate. It seemed to be a fairly big political issue with President Reagan. What is interesting, or I guess kind of ironic, even though he made it an issue, once he was elected, he took no steps to unwind it. And of course, by that time, when he was elected, I guess some of the land had been given back, but the actual management of the canal. So it's all kind of seems like, at least with him, it was largely kind of a political issue. So when you dive into it, there's a lot more there, and as I said, I think there's clearly the tolls have gone up. One can't. There's no discrimination at all. One thing that America has benefited through immensely during the Panamanian control was that they, decided, going back to ships getting ever bigger, I guess it was 10-year, it was a multi-year project, but around 2008, they decided we've got to expand this or have bigger locks, or we're going to lose business to the Suez Canal. And it was driven by the container ships. So they implemented that. They spent over $5 billion of their funds doing that, obviously have additional operating cost. So if the U.S. had, it's all a kind of a hypothetical, but if we had not turned it over, I'm not sure there would be a hue and cry to expand it so bigger container ships can go through. Perhaps there would have been, but you don't know. But so that was, partly explained why tolls have gone up also.
That's a really good point. If we had still been in control, would we have budgeted for the expansion of the canal to allow for, the larger ships as they were going through? And, you mentioned 1964. I did a little reading on that last night. And what's scary about it is it was protests. So Panamanians on one side, Americans on the other. And it came down to, somebody grabbed a Panamanian flag and desecrated the flag. And, I think it was ripped or burned. And that led to the violence where people were killed. And it just goes to show you how quickly a situation like that can go south. Back when I was on active duty, we used to talk about the impact of the strategic lance corporal anywhere in the world. Yes. And how that can blow up on you in the news cycle in 24 hours. And so I think it's very important that cooler heads prevail and that the dialogue continue. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about Secretary Rubio's visit. But I'd like to kind of get your summary on why you think the Panama Canal matters strategically for the U.S. Why is this debate all of a sudden come up, and how does it serve our economic and our national security?
Well, it definitely benefits us in that something on the order of 75% of the cargo in ships going through the Panama Canal is either destined for the U.S. or coming from the U.S. It's much more destined for the U.S. because we're importing, much more than we export. But we get direct economic benefits if you didn't have the Panama Canal, and to put the tolls in context. I know when somebody, people in New York complain about paying $15 to go over the George Washington Bridge toll. If the public hears that a toll for an average ship going through the Panama Canal is $232,000, I can see where many of them would say, wow, somebody's being taken advantage of. And if they knew that 75%, came to or from America, you'd say there's an indirect cost. But if you look at all the facts and you put into context, the cost of the canal and the 8,000 miles that one saves, and literally that's 20 days, and you take the run cost of major ships, and you can back away and say, wow, the Panama is not only are those tolls reasonable, why aren't they much higher? I mean, the simple reality is if it wasn't the Panamanians running it and it was hypothetically a private equity entity that bought the Panama Canal for whatever they bought, they're going to look to maximize their income. And when you realize that the Panama Canal is at capacity, it has been at capacity in terms of passages. It's 38 ships a day, which translates into 14,000 a year. You can't really do more than that. And so if you were to take all of that and take the literally in some cases, 20 days of additional sailing, could be $5 million. And so if somebody was looking at it purely from how do we maximize it, the tolls could be worse. So we have benefited from that. We have benefited immensely from the expansion of the canal. One of the numbers I looked at, if you take a container ship, and the biggest container ships, literally, if they're fully loaded, their toll can literally push $1 million. And you go and say, wow. But then when you back away and you realize that $1 million translates into, I think, $95 per TU, and that $95 per TU is 17/100% of the value of freight in that. And that's, because of that larger ship, it's much more cost efficient to move cargo from Asia to the U.S. now than it was. So you kind of, certainly not suggesting that Panamanians are doing us any favor, but it's worked out quite well for us from an economic standpoint. One is really hard pressed to see how, I ran the numbers and said if hypothetically, rather than when the Panamanians took over, if tolls had stayed just at the rate of inflation, and it couldn't do, without taking into account the additional investment, and you didn't allocate that to the percentage going to America, you kind of conclude, okay, well, America could save a little over $1 billion a year. But that, I'm not minimizing that number, but I certainly wouldn't think many people would say, well, to economically benefit $1 billion a year, we want to militarily take over a country, to put it in kind of a most strident comparison. So yeah, I fundamentally see the Panama Canal as benefiting commerce. I go back to the point that I made earlier. I believe, more trade is more peace. So yeah, I see it is continuing to work to our benefit. Yeah, we made it possible, but I'm not a big believer in the notion of what seems to be popular recently. It used to be ours. We want it back. That's a game that the U.S. would lose. France would say, here's your 15 million for the Louisiana Purchase. We want it back.
There you go. Well, really some interesting statistics there. So you're right. I mean, if you look at the tolls, they don't seem unreasonable for a 24,000 TEU ship. You said that ship's got $1 billion worth of cargo on it. So for scalable, a big ship like that is $1 million. Smaller ships are $230,000. You pointed out. That's 0.1% of that cargo on board. So that's the cost of doing business. Plus, you've got to pay all those workers and all those lock, engineers as the ship goes through. It's 51 miles of transit, and that costs money, and it's got to be sustained over time. You mentioned going around Cape Horn, and the additional 8,000 miles of transit. In the Suez, what we've learned from ships that are going around the Cape of Good Hope is it's at least $1 million in fuel that you're going to burn, and at least 14 days of additional transit. Now, that doesn't include other costs like the delay of ships getting to port, paying the crew, and everything else. So the Suez Red Sea example and what the Houthis are doing really exemplifies how difficult it could be if we had a problem in the Panama Canal. There's been a lot of discussion, as you said, on the canal, with this new administration. And some of that discussion is about foreign influence or the People's Republic of China control over the canal. Now, I think at issue is a company that runs one of the port facilities, CK Hutchinson, which was originated in Hong Kong, long before Hong Kong in 1999 became part of the People's Republic of China. So can you shed any light on this? Is there anything?
I'd be glad to, because I think there has been some confusion between the operation of the canal itself and the container terminals near either side. These terminals really have nothing to do with the canal, and are mainly what is referred to as transshipment terminals, where smaller feeder vessels connect, and those feeder vessels are going up and down the coast, the Atlantic and Pacific coast, and they connect with larger ships. In addition, these container terminals, handle cargo that moves to Panama itself and other Central American points. What's interesting is, well, first, if you back away, and only 20% of the transits through the Panama Canal are actual container ships, and so 80%, have nothing to do with those terminals. A tanker doesn't go to a container terminal, and even within that, because so many of those container ships that go through don't even go to any of those container terminals. They're not tying into feeding cargo. They're not moving cargo to Panama. So you're probably dealing with a relatively small single-digit percent that even call on those terminals. But more important, those terminals really have, they're not connected in any way to, there's a coincidental connection, and that some of the larger ships that pick up feeder cargo then go through the canal, but it's not part and parcel of that business. And then there are 5 container terminals in total. 3 on the one side, 2 on the other, and only 2 are the subject that has gotten a lot of attention, and they're owned by CK Hutchinson, who's been there since 1997. CK Hutchinson is a massive conglomerate that's involved in a whole bunch of different fields. Terminals is a part of their business, but it's less than 10%. They're involved in telecommunications. They're a Hong Kong-based company, publicly created. The Chinese government has no ownership interest. They're certainly not a official SOB, a state-owned enterprise. I mean, you take like a Chinese company like Costco, the very large container shipping company. Costco is a state-owned enterprise. The government of China owns 50% of it. Going back to your point earlier about subsidy, Costco, just as one company, has received, since they've been public, because they have to report this, a little over $2 billion in direct subsidy from the Chinese government.
Wow.
CK Hutchinson is not that at all. I got to know the company fairly well because I managed a large investment at the hedge fund I was at. If you kind of focus just on the terminal side, CK Hutchinson has close to 200 container terminals around the world, mostly in Europe and Asia. Those two terminals in Panama represent a little over 1% of their terminal business. So all of a sudden, you're kind of dealing with, a little over 1% of their terminal business in a division that is less than 10% of their revenue. In other words, it's not a driving force to CK Hutchinson. There wasn't anything that I've come across that was mysterious about their getting a lease to operate the terminal in 1997. It was renewed for another 21 years, 25 years in 1921. So it wasn't surprising to me, and I think people have been kind of conflating clearly a Hong Kong-based company. By the way, Hong Kong isn't really, well, it has that unique relationship with China, but the largest shareholder at CK Hutchinson is a gentleman, a billionaire that owns 30% of it, and he's a Hong Kong businessman. I mean, I don't. So the notion that somehow we have to watch out for that is a little puzzling. I guess the other thing, there was a reference to shortly after the meeting with Rubio, it was announced that Panama was going to be withdrawing its membership from the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, I remember that.
You get a lot of press, and and it was kind of aha. Well, I'm familiar broadly with the Belt and Road Initiative. It largely kind of ties into, when China builds something or infrastructure project that, in a country or something that they think might be good for them, which again, I don't find puzzling in that in the maritime supply chain, roughly kind of 50% of the world's cargo ships owe their living to China. And so, they're involved in this maritime supply chain across the board. So it wasn't puzzling to see that, something like Panama would be part of this. The fact that I think would surprise most people is that it isn't, I have not come across anything that has China or Panama became a member of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017. It's not clear tangibly that did anything other than they're kind of raising their hand and said, if you want to finance a project for us, we'd like to talk. This is a fact that I think would surprise people that get worked up about that. As we speak, there are 149 countries that are members of the Belt and Road Initiative. By simple math, that's over 70% of the countries in the world. That includes 21 countries in Central America and the Caribbean that are members of the Belt and Road Initiatives. Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and so I guess my point is, broadly speaking, I don't find that surprising. So those are the only two Chinese connections that I'm aware of in the Panama Canal, and both of those are kind of a head scratcher to me in terms of why that would be a security reason, and most importantly, while Teddy Roosevelt built the canal with national security top of mind, and the canal was used in a very massive way by our Navy in World War II. That was 8 decades ago, and so the action actual strategic relevance of the Panama Canal is diminished to the point where it's almost, in my view, kind of non-existent today.
Interesting analysis. And, thanks for shedding light on where this discussion on Chinese influence in the canal is coming from. Obviously, I think that the current government is on guard as a result of some of the policies that China has instituted, particularly in the Western Pacific. So if you look at one of the examples I use all the time is Sri Lanka. A lot of investment by China in Sri Lanka, which they could not afford. A port facility which ultimately cost them somewhere in the realm of $8 to $9 billion, and the Sri Lankans couldn't even pay the interest on the debt. Now, the Chinese have investors just like us. The system, they may not be capitalists, they may be communists, but the system works the same. Somebody puts money down, they want a return on that investment. So they called in that debt from the Sri Lankans, who said, sorry, we can't pay. And the Chinese said, you got to give us something in return. And that was, unfortunately, the port of Hambantota, which, John, is a big port. And one of the concerns is the way the Chinese are acting out there in the Pacific, particularly in places like Second Thomas Shoal, is or the Marshalls. How long is it going to take before the gates to that port go shut to U.S. warships? There's already been interactions with the Chinese on Coast Guard trying to go to places and get gas, and then U.S. Commercial assets. So I think that is the fear. But I appreciate everything that you just said to enlighten us on where some of these concerns in the Panama Canal Zone are coming from. Last question. Can you give us a quick summary of how you think the visit with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Panamanian President Jose Raul Molino went? It looked pretty good. And, the thing that I'm encouraged by is there is dialogue. So, the president threw out some challenges. Rubio's gone down. He's talked to the Panamanians, and there's dialogue. And as you said, there's movement on the One Belt, One Road initiative, and hopefully movement on other things too. Can you tell us about that?
Well, there hasn't been a lot of, the public reporting kind of is spoke of, clearly we sent a message that we're concerned and we want to, and the concerns seem to be focused on these terminals. I guess they could go through a process of canceling those terminals and reletting them. I don't know what I guess there's an agreement. There'd probably be litigation related to that. If they rebid them, there's the other terminals in Panama. One's controlled by a group out of Singapore, another is private equity in the U.S. Some people I've heard say, well, we'd be in better shape to have these controlled by American entities. That was a little puzzling to me because the premise seems to be that somehow people are connecting these terminals as part and parcel of the canal, and that if some of the comments in a recent Senate hearing got quite fanciful in terms of what somebody could do, and it seemed to be the working assumption on their part seemed to be that somebody could shut down the canal, and we need the canal for our own strategic naval vessels. That's where one of the things when I got into this project and knowing how important it was for the Navy during World War II, I tried to define the actual Navy usage today, and that was that wasn't something that was easy. I attempted without success to have conversations with the Panamanian embassy and even the Navy in terms of, well, can you give me a list? And not surprisingly, that wasn't volunteered. But what I did find through a pretty diligent search was I only came across 5 actual naval vessel transits over the last 8 years that were publicly reported. And every single one of them were generally vessels that were built at Ingalls on the Gulf Coast, that as soon as they came out, they were stationed in San Diego. So they went through the Panama Canal one time, and that was a reminder to me that one of the big things that has changed. We now have more carrier strike groups connected to the Pacific. And as you know, and we talked about, our carriers are too big to go through the Panama Canal anyway. Right. So it just it strikes me that a lot of people are kind of working with facts that aren't consistent with what I see. If somebody thought that the Panama Canal is a major strategic asset that our Navy always has to have total control of, but the facts don't seem to kind of tie into that. It's been quite emphatic, from Panama that, we're not going to give it back. And then when this talk starts to get in terms of, military usage, that then really requires some real serious thinking, because you're at least from my standpoint, that is the one thing that would be extraordinarily disruptive to commerce, any sort of military attempt to take it over. And then even if one could hypothetically make that occur, I believe there was an article where one retired admiral suggested that, a military operation would take, 90,000 soldiers. And presumably, obviously, we could win if we wanted to do that. But then, how many people are to guard it? And all of a sudden you have a enraged nation that feels you've taken something away from us. And before you know it, you have another hot spot. It just seems to take any action beyond diplomatic discussions brings with it much more problems than anything would solve.
Yeah, and let's hope it doesn't come to that. I think, like I said, cooler heads will prevail here, and I hope the dialogue continues with the Panamanians. I know there's some discussion now about whether or not there'll be, free passage or reduced rates for U.S. flag ships down there. That's not really clear, but I'm sure there'll be much more discussion on that in the days and weeks to come. Well, John, that's all we have time for today. And folks, that's a wrap. John, always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm always just impressed with the factual database and the experience you have in the commercial shipping sector, a lifetime of achievement. And folks, if you liked what you heard today, grab a copy of Giants of the Sea, or stay tuned, because on the 26th of March, we'll be launching our first book from the Center for Maritime Strategy. It's called Returning from Ebb Tide, and it tells the story of the sad atrophy of our commercial maritime base here in the United States. And John McCown has got 2 great chapters in there. He talks a lot about Malcolm McLean and the box, if you will. And I think really, really good. So stay tuned for that. I would like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you have not heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here today can be found on our new website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. Thanks again to Dataminr for the sponsorship and support, and James Peterson, our sound engineer. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation. That's going to be on the challenge in the Arctic in a couple of weeks. Thanks. Out here.